Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into a room you may have never stood in yourself but somehow feel like you remember. A room that smelled like percolated coffee and dish soap and something warm always moving on the back burner. A room where the radio lived on the counter, where the linoleum was mopped every Thursday morning without fail, and where a woman in a house dress stood at the sink before the rest of the house was even awake, already thinking about what everyone would eat for dinner. Before we go any further, I just want to say a genuine, heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. These suggestions are not small things to me, they shape everything this channel becomes, and knowing that you trust me with the ideas that matter to you makes every script feel more meaningful. If you are watching for the first time, consider subscribing, and if this is the kind of content that settles you at the end of a long day, I hope you will stick around. The channel is also now on Spotify, so if you prefer to listen with your eyes closed and the lights already off, there is a link in the description waiting for you. Now, dim the lights if you haven't already. Switch on a fan for that soft, steady hum. Pull your blanket up a little higher. Make yourself completely comfortable, the way you only let yourself be when no one is watching and the night has finally gone quiet. Because we're about to spend some time in a place that deserves to be revisited slowly. Have you ever wondered what a Tuesday morning actually felt like in a 1962 kitchen? What it sounded like when a percolator finished its cycle and the whole house smelled like coffee before anyone had opened a single curtain? What it was like to reach into a refrigerator that had no ice maker, no filtered water dispenser, no digital temperature display, just a cold interior and a block of cheese wrapped in wax paper. What did it feel like to cook a full dinner from scratch every single evening, not as a hobby, not as self-care, but simply as the thing that had to be done? What was the texture of a kitchen that had no microwave, no food processor, no way to look up a recipe in under 4 seconds? And what did we lose exactly when we replaced all of it? And just like that, it is 1962. The percolator has just clicked off. Someone has already set the table. The kitchen window is fogged faintly from the warmth inside, and beyond it the neighbourhood is just beginning to stir. The day, quiet and unhurried, is only just beginning. You hear it before you're fully awake. A low rhythmic gurgling from the kitchen, steady and assured. The sound of the percolator doing what it has done every morning for as long as you can remember. By the time you reach the kitchen, the coffee is already dark and strong, and filling the room with a smell so specific to this decade that it might as well be a calendar page. There is no button to press, no pod to load. The ritual has already happened, tended to by the first person out of bed, usually your mother, sometimes your grandmother, occasionally your father on Saturdays when he moves through the kitchen quietly so as not to wake anyone else. You pour your cup and stand at the counter, and the morning has already begun before you have said a single word. The percolator itself is a sturdy thing, aluminum or stainless steel, with a glass knob on the lid that lets you watch the coffee as it cycles upward, dark and churning, before settling back down. There is something almost meditative about watching it. The process cannot be rushed. The coffee takes as long as it takes, and the kitchen fills with its smell in the meantime, and the smell is the signal that the day is real and has begun, and that other people are awake somewhere in the house, and that things will proceed in their ordinary way. This is not nothing. In fact, it is quietly everything. The cup you drink it from is ceramic, heavy, with a handle thick enough to hold comfortably in a cold hand. There is no paper sleeve. There is no plastic lid designed for walking. You stand at the counter or you sit at the table and you drink the coffee there, in the kitchen, in the morning, and the act of standing still long enough to finish a cup of coffee is itself a kind of structure that the day is built around. Your mother takes hers with a little cream that she pours from a small ceramic pitcher that lives in the refrigerator. Your father takes his black. You have learned, by watching, exactly how each person in the house takes their coffee, the same way you have learned everything else important about them. By the time the second cup is poured, the kitchen is warmer. The percolator has done its work and sits cooling on the burner. The shelves are not deep. The crisper drawers are small and slightly temperamental, prone to freezing the lettuce if the temperature drifts too cold, which it does sometimes in winter when the kitchen itself is cool and the refrigerator overcorrects. You learn to put the lettuce on the upper shelf instead, wrapped in a damp cloth the way your mother showed you, the way her mother showed her. Knowledge passed between women across decades like a folded note. What is inside the refrigerator at any given moment is a precise inventory of the week. There is no excess. There is no backup jar of something you already have an open jar of. No 3 varieties of the same condiment. No forgotten container pushed to the back and left to become unrecognizable. Space is too limited and money too deliberate for that kind of waste. You know what is in there because you put it there, and you know when it needs to be used because you have been thinking about it since you bought it. This intimacy with the contents of the refrigerator shapes everything about how the family eats. Meals are not decided in the moment, not assembled from whatever happens to be available. They are planned, quietly, in the back of a woman's mind throughout the day, a continuous low calculation that accounts for what is fresh and what is aging and what will not survive another 24 hours without becoming a problem. The leftover roast from Sunday becomes Monday's hash. The slightly soft tomatoes become Tuesday's sauce. Nothing announces itself as a leftover because nothing is presented that way. It is simply dinner, made from what the week has given you. The refrigerator hums. It hums loudly enough that you stop noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of your own breathing, and then one night it stops, and the silence wakes you, and you lie in bed knowing something is wrong before you can name what it is. That hum is the sound of the household running, the sound of cold being maintained against the warmth of the kitchen, the warmth of the house, the warmth of summer pressing in through the walls. It is a small mechanical miracle, and in the early 1960s it is still new enough that some families treat it with a faint reverence, the way you treat something that has recently replaced something much harder. Before the refrigerator, there was the icebox, which required a delivery of actual ice and a pan beneath it that had to be emptied regularly before it overflowed onto the kitchen floor. The transition to the electric refrigerator happened gradually across the 1940s and 50s, and by 1960 most households have one, but the icebox mind remains. The habits formed by scarcity and limitation do not disappear simply because the technology improves. You still buy only what you need. You still use what you have. You still think of food as something that requires tending, not simply storing. Stand in front of a modern refrigerator and the difference announces itself immediately. The shelves go back much further than seems reasonable. The drawers are labelled and designated and sorted by category. There are compartments for things that did not exist as categories in 1962. A drawer specifically for deli meat. A shelf with a special humidity setting for cheese. A door lined with bottles of water that exist only because someone somewhere decided tap water was insufficient. The abundance is real, and it is comfortable, and yet something in the organisation has gone slightly abstract. The connection between what is in the refrigerator and what will be eaten tonight stretched thin across too many options and too much space. The 1960s refrigerator asked you to pay attention. And in paying attention, you knew exactly where you stood. It sits on the counter near the toaster, squat and metal and painted in some soft colour that has faded slightly over the years, cream or pale yellow or a green that was probably called something cheerful when it was new. The bread box holds 1 loaf, sometimes 2, and the bread inside is real bread, the kind bought fresh from the bakery or baked at home on Friday. The kind that goes stale within a few days because it contains nothing to prevent it from doing so. You lift the lid, and the smell that rises is simple and warm and completely without the chemical sweetness that will eventually come to define shelf-stable bread. You take a slice and press it down into the toaster and listen to it sink. The bread box is not a luxury item. It is not decorative, not aspirational, not something purchased because a magazine suggested it would make the kitchen more charming. It is simply the correct place for bread to live, the place that keeps it from going stale too quickly in the open air, while also keeping it from the moisture that would turn it to mould if sealed too tightly. It occupies the same counter space every day of every year, and its presence is so expected that its absence would feel immediately wrong, the way a missing chair at the table feels wrong even before you identify exactly what is different. The loaf inside has been sliced at the bakery, or sliced at home with the bread knife, the long serrated one that hangs on the magnetic strip above the cutting board. Each slice is irregular in the way that hand-cut bread is always slightly irregular, a little thicker at one end, a little thinner at the other, and this irregularity is not a flaw. It is evidence that a person made this, not a machine calibrated for perfect uniformity. You butter the thick end and give the thin end to the youngest child at the table, because the youngest child does not yet know to object. Bread in this decade is a daily thing in the most literal sense. It appears at most meals, not as a restaurant gesture, not as an artisanal accompaniment, but as part of the meal itself. The thing that stretches a bowl of soup into something filling, the thing that soaks up gravy from the Sunday roast, the thing that becomes a sandwich on Monday with the leftover meat and a thin scrape of mustard. You do not admire the bread, you eat it. Its virtue is that it is there, that it was bought or made, that someone thought about it and brought it home and put it in the bread box where it belongs. By Thursday the loaf is going stale, and the slices at the end are cut thinner to make them last, or they are set aside to become breadcrumbs or bread pudding or croutons for the salad on Friday. Nothing is thrown away while there is still something to be done with it. The bread box empties completely before it is refilled, and the day it is refilled the kitchen smells the way kitchens are supposed to smell, of fresh bread and the particular warmth that surrounds it. We have more bread now than any previous generation could have imagined. We have sourdoughs and brioche and 12-grain loaves and flatbreads and wraps and gluten-free alternatives to all of them. And yet somehow the bread lives in a plastic bag on a refrigerator shelf, or in a drawer, or sometimes still in a box, though the boxes now tend toward the decorative. The ease with which bread can be kept for 2 and 3 weeks without spoiling is a triumph of food science and a convenience no one would willingly give back. But somewhere in that triumph, the daily conversation between a household and its loaf of bread has gone quiet, and with it something small and reliable and warm. There is no shortcut waiting for you in the freezer. There is no delivery app, no rotisserie chicken from a grocery store hot case, no jar of pre-made sauce that requires only pasta and a pot of boiling water. Dinner in the 1960s kitchen is built from the beginning, every evening, by hands that have already done a full day of other work. You peel the potatoes yourself, you brown the meat yourself, you make the gravy from the drippings in the pan, adding flour and stock and stirring until it thickens just the way it should, the way you learned by watching someone else do it until the motion became your own. The meal takes an hour, sometimes 2, and then it is eaten in 20 minutes and the dishes begin. This is not resented, or not always. It is simply what dinner requires, the same way sleep requires lying down, the same way a garden requires water. The labour is so woven into the fabric of the day that it does not present itself as labour in the way that word is usually understood. It is just the afternoon moving toward evening, the kitchen growing warm, the smell shifting and building as one thing finishes and another begins. The onions that went in first are soft and golden by the time the meat is ready. The potatoes have been boiling long enough to test with a fork. The table needs to be set, and someone is being called to set it. The woman cooking this meal has likely been thinking about it since morning, not obsessively, not with dread, but with the low, continuous attention that meal planning requires when there are no alternatives waiting to fill the gap. She knows what is in the refrigerator. She knows what is in the pantry. She knows who in the family will not touch the casserole if it has too many onions visible on the surface, and who will eat anything put in front of them without comment. She has factored all of this into what is on the stove right now. There is a skill set involved in this kind of daily cooking that is difficult to quantify and easy to underestimate. It is not the skill of the recipe, not the ability to follow instructions on a card, but something deeper and more practical. The ability to manage time and heat and ingredients simultaneously, to know when the bread needs to come out while the sauce still needs another 10 minutes, to know by smell when something is nearly done, to taste a thing and understand what it needs without measuring anything. This knowledge lives in the hands and the nose and the tongue. It is learned by doing the thing every day for years until the doing becomes instinct. The kitchen in the 1960s is a room of accumulated expertise, and the expertise belongs almost entirely to women, which is a fact that contains both something beautiful and something deeply unfair, and which does not resolve neatly in either direction. The beauty is real. The skill is real. The unfairness is also real. All of it is true at the same time. By the time the meal is on the table, the kitchen looks like a meal has been cooked in it, because it has. There are pots on the stove and a cutting board that needs washing, and a dish towel draped over the oven handle that has absorbed the afternoon. The family sits. The food is passed. The meal is eaten with the ordinary unself-consciousness of people who have eaten together every night of their lives and expect to do so again tomorrow. And then the dishes begin, and the kitchen is restored, and the next meal is already somewhere in the back of a mind beginning to be planned. We call this labour invisible now in historical retrospect, and the word is accurate in ways that are worth sitting with. The meals appeared, the family ate. No one totalled the hours. It is not in a separate room, not pushed into a corner, not an afterthought between the island and the living room. The kitchen table is the centre of the house, the place where the family lands every evening at roughly the same time, where homework gets spread out in the afternoon and pushed aside when dinner needs to be set, where Sunday mornings stretch long over coffee and the newspaper, where neighbours sit when they stop by because the kitchen is where you receive people you're actually glad to see. The table has a particular chair that everyone knows belongs to your father. Everyone knows it without being told. The table itself is usually formica, easy to wipe, resistant to heat, available in colours that belong entirely to this decade, a warm red, a speckled grey, a pale turquoise that looks like summer fields. The chairs match or nearly match, chrome legs and padded seats covered in a vinyl that squeaks slightly when you shift your weight and holds the warmth of whoever was just sitting there. These are not aspirational objects. No one has chosen them to make a statement. They have been chosen because they are practical and affordable and easy to clean, which in a household with children is its own form of wisdom. Meals are eaten here every evening, not at a different time for each person, not in front of the television on a tray, not standing over the sink because someone is in a hurry and cannot be expected to sit. The evening meal is a fixed point in the day, and the kitchen table is where it happens, and everyone in the family knows approximately when that point arrives and makes themselves present for it. This is not discussed. It is not scheduled. It is simply understood, the way the seasons are understood, as something that comes around reliably and requires no negotiation. The conversation at the table is not curated. It is the conversation of people who see each other every day and have run out of anything particularly dramatic to report, and have learned to talk about ordinary things with the ease of people who are comfortable with each other. How school was, whether it is going to rain tomorrow, what is happening down the street. Someone heard something, someone has a question, someone is annoyed about something, and the annoyance surfaces briefly and is absorbed by the general warmth of the table and the meal, and the fact that everyone is here. Children learn things at the kitchen table that are not on any curriculum. They learn how adults talk to each other when they are tired. They learn how disagreement sounds when it is handled with patience and when it is not. They learn the names of the neighbours, the texture of their parents' friendships, the shape of the adult world as seen from a child's chair at the corner of a formica table with chrome legs. They learn what is funny in this family and what is not, what is serious and what can be laughed at, how to sit still for 20 minutes while other people finish talking about something they do not understand yet. The kitchen table of the 1960s is not a relic of some simpler or better time. It is a technology, as surely as any appliance in the room, a piece of furniture engineered to gather people and hold them still long enough to become a family. We have not stopped having tables. We have simply stopped requiring that everyone arrive at the same time and stay until the meal is finished. The table is still there. The gathering is what has become optional. The pantry is not a walk-in. It is a set of shelves, maybe a cupboard, maybe a narrow closet off the kitchen, and what lines those shelves has been chosen carefully because money and space do not permit waste. Canned green beans, canned tomatoes, canned peaches and syrup, a can of cream of mushroom soup that will become the base of something at some point this week. In the 1960s, canned food is not a compromise. It is infrastructure. It is the reason a family can eat when the fresh vegetables have run out and payday is still 3 days away. You reach for a can, and the label is bright and confident, and the contents inside, when you open them, smell of salt and industry and a particular kind of reliability. The canned goods are organised with a logic that is entirely practical and slightly personal. The most used cans live at eye level, within easy reach, because reaching for them is something that happens multiple times a week, and efficiency matters when you're managing a household kitchen with the same daily attention a small business requires. The less used cans sit higher or lower, and behind each front row there is a second row, older cans pushed back as newer ones come in from the grocery bags, a quiet rotation that ensures nothing expires unnoticed. The can opener is manual, mounted to the edge of the counter or the side of a cabinet, and you have been operating it since you were old enough to be trusted near the sharp edge it produces. It requires a small amount of skill and a steady hand, and the lid, when it comes free, must be handled carefully and deposited directly into the trash so no one steps on it. This is a thing you know without thinking about it, the same way you know not to leave a wet knife in the dish basin where it can rust. The kitchen has its protocols, accumulated and specific, and you move through them automatically. The cream of mushroom soup is a particular kind of 1960s pantry magic. It begins as a can of something thick and salt-heavy and vaguely grey, and it ends up as the base of casseroles, the binder in green bean dishes, the sauce that goes over pork chops when the oven has been on low all afternoon. It appears on the back of its own label in 6 different recipes, and all 6 of those recipes have been made in this kitchen at least once, some of them regularly. It is not elegant food. It is not the food of restaurant menus or cooking magazines with glossy pages. It is the food of a household running, of someone who has figured out how to feed a family well on a budget that does not have a great deal of flexibility. There is something in this pantry system that the modern kitchen has largely replaced with the grocery run, the habit of buying what you need for the next few days rather than maintaining a standing inventory that can sustain the household through an unexpected week. The pantry of the 1960s was a buffer against uncertainty. A small private reserve against the week that went sideways, the paycheck that stretched thin, the storm that kept everyone home. It required tending, required thought, required a woman who kept a running mental inventory of what was in there and what was getting low. Open a well-stocked 1960s pantry, and you're looking at a household that has thought ahead. You're looking at someone who took the long view about feeding people, who understood that provisioning a family is not a series of individual decisions, but a continuous practice that rewards attention and punishes carelessness. The cans on those shelves are not just food. They are evidence of a certain kind of competence, quiet, unannounced, and completely essential. There is a mould in the refrigerator right now, and it will be served tonight at dinner with something inside it. A layer of fruit perhaps, or shredded carrots suspended in lime green, or cream cheese clouds floating in strawberry red. To understand the 1960s kitchen is to understand that gelatin is not a joke. It is not a punchline. It is presented on the good platter, unmoulded with care onto a bed of lettuce leaves, and placed at the centre of the table as though it has earned its position there. And in a way it has, because it took time and planning and the right amount of cold and a steady hand when it came out of the mould and held its shape, which it does tonight, trembling only slightly, gleaming under the kitchen light. The mould itself is a thing of modest ambition, a ring shape usually, or a fish, or something fluted and decorative that turns ordinary gelatin into something with architectural presence. You have greased it lightly before pouring, and you have remembered to add the fruit at the right moment in the setting process, not too soon when the gelatin is still liquid and everything sinks to the bottom, not too late when the surface has already firmed and the fruit cannot be pressed in evenly. There is a technique to this that takes a few failed attempts to learn, and once you know it, you apply it without thinking. The appeal of the Jell-O mould in this decade makes a particular kind of sense when you understand the context in which it exists. Refrigeration is still relatively new enough to feel like a gift. The ability to make something cold and structured and shimmering in a home kitchen is a small domestic miracle that has not yet worn off its novelty. And the gelatin manufacturers, who are not modest about their product's potential, publish cookbooks and recipe cards and advertisements suggesting an almost limitless variety of things that can be achieved with a packet of powder and some boiling water, savoury moulds and sweet ones, salads that are not salads in any traditional sense, desserts that wobble. There is also the matter of presentation, which the 1960s kitchen takes seriously in a way that is easy to underestimate from this distance. The meal is not just food. It is something prepared and offered, and the offering has a visual dimension that matters. The Jell-O mould on its lettuce bed, garnished perhaps with a small arrangement of fruit or a spoonful of mayonnaise, or a sprinkle of something that provides contrast, is a way of saying that this dinner was thought about, that someone took the time to make it look like something. This is a form of care made visible. We look at the Jell-O mould now with a kind of affectionate condescension, and the condescension is not entirely unfair because some of what went into those moulds was genuinely strange. But underneath the strangeness was an aspiration that is worth taking seriously, the aspiration to make the everyday meal into something presented with intention, something that acknowledged the people eating it by acknowledging that how food is offered matters as much as what it is. The mould holds its shape until it is cut. Then it releases, and the table takes on the particular quality of a meal in progress, and the gelatin, which was a thing of careful structure a moment ago, becomes just food, eaten and finished and cleared away. But for the few minutes it sits whole on its platter. It is something your mother made with her hands and her planning and her refrigerator, and that is not nothing at all. Before the sun is fully up, before the coffee's on, before the first footstep sounds on the kitchen linoleum, the bottles have already arrived. They are standing on the back step in a small wire carrier, cold and clear and sealed with a cardboard cap, and the cream has risen to the top overnight the way cream does when nothing has been done to prevent it. You bring them inside and set them in the refrigerator, and the empty bottles from yesterday go back out to the step, rinsed clean, ready to return. The milkman knows your household. He knows how many bottles you take and on which days, and if you need an extra quart this week, you have left a note. This is a system of extraordinary mutual trust operating largely without ceremony. The milk arrives, the empties disappear. The ledger is settled at the end of the month when the milkman comes to the door for payment and your mother writes the check or counts out the cash while they exchange a few words about the weather or the neighbourhood. The same brief conversation that constitutes the full extent of a relationship built on years of reliable daily exchange. He has never been inside your house. He knows your family by the bottles. The milk itself is different from what will eventually replace it. It is whole, always whole, because the concept of percentage milk fat as a consumer choice is still in the future. The cream line is visible through the glass, a distinct pale layer sitting above the whiter body of the milk, and the first pour from a new bottle goes into the coffee, because that is where the cream belongs, and everyone understands this without discussion. The bottle is cold enough that the glass fogs when you bring it into the warm kitchen, and the cardboard cap lifts off in one piece if you press the centre correctly. A small satisfying skill that every child in the household has mastered. Glass holds cold differently than plastic. This is not a romantic notion, but a simple physical fact that anyone who has drunk milk from a glass bottle remembers. The particular density of the cold, the way the bottle sweats in a warm hand, the slight weight of it that makes it feel substantial in a way a plastic jug never quite manages. The milk tastes the same or nearly the same, and yet the experience of drinking it is different. Contained in glass, delivered by a person who knew your address. Part of a system that required your empties back in order to function. The milkman vanishes from most American doorsteps by the early 1970s, replaced by the supermarket dairy aisle with its waxed cartons and plastic jugs, and the logic that it is more efficient to buy a week's worth at once than to receive 2 bottles every morning. The efficiency argument is correct, and the transition happens quickly, and most households adapt without much grief because the milk is still cold, and the coffee still needs it, and the practical outcome is the same. What goes with the milkman is harder to name. It is the daily small proof that a system exists for you specifically, that someone has thought about your household's needs and arranged their morning around meeting them. In the 1960s, this is not unusual. The baker delivers, the dry cleaner sends a truck. The world still operates on a scale of personal arrangement that the supermarket and its vast impersonal abundance will eventually, slowly, replace. It is heavy enough that you use 2 hands to move it, and it lives on the back burner because putting it away would only mean getting it back out again tomorrow. It is your grandmother's, or it was bought the year your parents married, and it has been seasoned by 10,000 meals, each one adding its own dark layer to the surface until the iron has become something almost organic. You cook eggs in it in the morning, and cornbread in it in the afternoon, and pork chops in it in the evening, and you do not wash it with soap because everyone knows that soap ruins cast iron. You wipe it out with a cloth while it's still warm and set it back on the burner, and it is ready again before it has even had time to cool. The skillet does not ask for much attention. It requires consistent use and occasional reseasoning, a thin coat of fat worked into the iron in a low oven until the surface drinks it in and goes dark and slightly glossy. Beyond that, it asks only to be used, and it rewards use with a cooking surface that improves over time, that holds heat with a steadiness no thin-bottomed modern pan can match, that releases food cleanly when the seasoning is right and in ways that tell you exactly when it needs more care when it is not. There is a relationship between a cook and a well-seasoned cast-iron skillet that is unlike the relationship between a cook and any other piece of kitchen equipment. The skillet accumulates history. Every meal cooked in it has left something behind, a microscopic layer of polymerized fat that is also a record of what has been made here. The bacon grease of 1,000 mornings, the butter of 1,000 evenings, the cornmeal from Friday nights going back further than anyone in the kitchen can specifically remember. When you cook in a skillet that old, you're cooking in something that has been prepared for you by everyone who used it before. The eggs come out better in the cast iron than anywhere else. The edges crisping in the fat while the centre sets just past translucent, the bottom developing a thin golden crust that no non-stick surface will ever replicate. You eat them standing at the counter sometimes because the skillet is still on the stove and the plates are across the kitchen, and the eggs are best right now, immediately, while they're still making the small sound of something freshly cooked. Your mother would have something to say about eating standing up. Your mother is not awake yet. The cast iron skillet survives this era and the next and the one after that, largely unchanged and unchanged because it does not need to change. It is not improved by being made lighter or thinner or more convenient. Its virtues are its weight and its thickness and its indifference to high heat, and its memory of every meal that has ever been cooked in it. It is the oldest technology in the 1960s kitchen, and also, in many ways, the most reliable. We have rediscovered it. That is what the cooking magazines say, as though the skillet went somewhere and came back, when in truth it simply waited in the kitchens of people who never stopped using it. Dark and heavy and faintly smoking on a back burner, entirely unbothered by the decades moving past it. The shortening sights in a blue and white can near the stove, and it has been there so long the label has gone slightly soft along the edges. You scoop it with a tablespoon into the skillet and watch it melt, clear and quiet, coating the iron in a thin film that everything will cook in today. Lard renders in a small pot on Saturdays. Butter comes in paper-wrapped quarters and lives in a dish on the counter, because refrigerated butter does not spread, and your mother does not have patience for bread that tears. In the 1960s kitchen there is no anxiety about fat. Fat is how things taste right. Fat is how your grandmother's pie crust holds together when you fold it, how the biscuits get their height, how the green beans become something worth eating. Lard is rendered from pork fat, the same pork that has provided the Sunday roast and the weekday chops and the bacon that goes in the cast iron skillet every morning. Nothing from the pig is wasted in a kitchen that takes its responsibilities seriously. The fat is cut into pieces and melted low and slow in a heavy pot until it separates into liquid and crackling, and the liquid is poured through a cloth into a wide-mouthed jar and stored in the refrigerator, white and solid, ready to be measured out for pie crust or skillet cornbread, or the beans that have been soaking since last night, and will simmer all morning with a piece of salt pork and a bay leaf and nothing else, because nothing else is needed. Butter is for the table and for baking and for the pan when the thing you're cooking is delicate enough to require something that adds flavour rather than just heat transfer. You cook the scrambled eggs in butter on days when there is time to do them slowly. You make the roux for the gravy with butter and flour in equal parts, stirring over medium heat until the colour deepens and the raw flour smell burns off, and something nutty and warm takes its place. Butter browns. It tells you things by smell and colour and sound that shortening cannot, and in the 1960s kitchen these signals are part of how cooking is monitored, by a person standing close enough to the stove to hear and smell everything happening on it. Crisco arrived earlier in the century with the promise that it was cleaner and more modern than lard, a manufactured product that could be stored at room temperature and measured with precision and trusted to behave the same way every single time. It conquered the American pantry with remarkable speed, helped along by recipe booklets distributed by its manufacturer and a national appetite for anything that promised consistency and convenience. By the 1960s, it is as established in the kitchen as the stove itself, reaching on its own for the can without deciding to, hand already curling around the spoon. The anxiety about fat arrives later, in the 70s and 80s, carried on a wave of nutritional research and public health campaigns that will eventually empty the butter dish and replace the Crisco can with a succession of alternatives, margarine and vegetable oil, and low-fat versions of everything, each one promising to be better and safer than what came before. Some of this is correct, some of it is complicated. All of it changes the way the American kitchen smells and tastes and operates in ways that are still being measured. But in this kitchen, in this decade, the butter is on the counter in its dish, and the Crisco is in its can, and the lard is in its jar in the refrigerator, and the food made with all of them is food that tastes the way food is supposed to taste, the way your grandmother's biscuits taste, the way the pie crust on Thanksgiving shatters into layers when you press a fork through it, the way the beans taste after they have simmered all morning with nothing but thyme and salt pork and the particular richness of rendered fat to give them their depth. You do not think about any of this while you're eating. That is the point. The fat has done its work invisibly, the way the best things in a kitchen always do, and what arrives at the table is simply dinner, warm and ready, asking nothing of you except that you sit down. It is small and wooden, and the lid sticks slightly when you open it, because it has been opened thousands of times in every kind of kitchen weather. Inside, the recipe cards are stained and soft at the edges, and written in several different hands, your mother's careful cursive, your grandmother's bolder script, the handwriting of a neighbour who gave you her angel food cake recipe the year you moved in, and whom you still think of every time you make it. There are no photographs. There are no step-by-step illustrations. There is only the assumption that you already know what medium heat means, what fold gently means, what cook until done means, and if you do not know yet, you will learn by standing in the kitchen with someone who does. The cards themselves are an archive of a particular kind of domestic knowledge, the kind that is assumed rather than explained, transmitted between women across kitchen tables and back fence conversations, and the margins of church cookbooks printed on mimeograph paper that smells faintly of ink and community fundraising. Some cards are clipped from the backs of product boxes, the condensed milk fudge recipe that has been in the family since the war, the pineapple upside-down cake from the back of a flour sack that was too good to throw away when the sack was empty. Others are written in pencil so light they require tilting toward the window to read, and this is itself a kind of inheritance, the squinting towards someone else's handwriting, the effort of deciphering a life. What the recipe cards do not contain is as significant as what they do. There are no yield amounts beyond serve 6 or makes 2 dozen. There are no nutrition labels, no calorie counts, no protein grams. There are no notes about substitutions for common allergens, because the concept of the recipe accommodating the diner, rather than the diner accommodating the recipe, is still largely in the future. The recipe is a set of instructions written by someone who cooked it regularly and knew, by feel, what they were trying to tell you, and the gap between what is written and what is meant is bridged by experience, by the knowledge you have already accumulated standing in this kitchen on all the previous evenings. You pull out the card for the pot roast, and it is spotted with something brown near the bottom right corner, a drip from a spoon held too close, and this stain has been on the card for so long, it is simply part of the card now, as permanent and unremarkable as the handwriting itself. The instructions say season well and brown on all sides, before adding liquid, and these 5 words contain a full understanding of why browning matters, what it does to the meat and the eventual gravy, why skipping the step produces a result that is technically cooked, but somehow flat, somehow missing the depth that the browned surface creates. You know this not because the card explains it, but because you have watched it done enough times that your hands now know what well-browned looks like before your mind catches up to name it. The recipe box is a record of what this family ate across decades, which is to say, it is a record of who this family was. The Christmas cookies appear every November when the box comes down from the shelf. The summer cake made with fresh peaches shows up in August when the peaches are in and the kitchen is already warm enough without the oven, but the cake is worth it. The soup that uses the leftover Thanksgiving turkey carcass has its own card, though it is barely a recipe at all, more a reminder of proportions for someone who already knows the rest by heart. The box holds the whole year inside it, organised loosely by season and occasion and the urgency of whoever wrote the card. We have not lost recipes. We have more recipes than any generation before us has ever had access to, more than could be cooked in a lifetime, available in seconds on a screen that fits in a pocket. What we have lost is the handwriting, the stain in the corner, the neighbour's name on the back of the card in a hand you recognise without reading it, the particular quality of an instruction written by someone who assumed you were standing in a kitchen like theirs, with equipment like theirs, with hands that had already made 100 meals and would know what to do when the written instruction ran out. A downloaded recipe is complete and precise and often excellent. It has been tested and retested, and the yield is exact and the oven temperature is specific, and there are photographs of every stage, so nothing is left to interpretation. It trusts you with nothing because it needs to work for everyone. And this universal reliability is also a kind of distance, the distance between a letter written to you specifically and a notice posted where anyone might read it. The recipe box assumes you. It was written by someone who knew your kitchen, your stove, your hands, your family's preferences, and embedded that knowledge in every casual instruction and every gap between the lines. When you open it and pull out a card and begin to cook from it, you're not just following a recipe. You're in conversation with everyone who cooked from it before you, and the food that comes out of the oven carries something of that conversation into the room. You go on Thursday, or Friday, or whatever day your family has always gone, the day that fits between payday and the weekend, the day when the store is not yet crowded and the produce is still fresh from the morning delivery. You go with a list written on the back of an envelope and you buy for the week ahead with a precision that requires knowing what you plan to cook every single day. Nothing goes in the cart without a purpose. The butcher cuts your meat to order behind the counter. The produce is not pre-washed, not pre-cut, not sealed in plastic with a steaming instruction printed on the lid. You bring it home and you prepare it yourself, and the preparation is part of the meal. The grocery store of the early 1960s is not yet the vast warehouse of the later decades. It is a mid-sized neighbourhood institution, familiar enough that you know which checkout clerk works on Thursdays and which aisle the baking supplies moved to when they rearranged things last spring. The produce section smells of cool, damp earth and the particular sweetness of things recently picked, and you choose each piece individually, pressing the tomatoes, checking the bottom of the strawberry carton, selecting the heads of lettuce one at a time the way someone taught you to, and the way you will eventually teach someone else. The list on the back of the envelope is a document of intention. You made it this morning at the kitchen table after looking in the refrigerator and the pantry, and the bread box and calculating the week ahead, what is planned for dinner each night, what needs to be replenished, what the children asked for that is within reason and within budget. The list moves through the store in the order of the aisles, because you have been shopping here long enough to know the layout well enough to plan around it, and deviating from the list requires a reason, a special occasion, something that catches your eye and justifies itself on its own terms. The butcher counter deserves its own attention because in 1962 it is still a place of genuine exchange rather than a wall of prepackaged trays. You tell the butcher what you're making, and he recommends the cut or confirms your choice and wraps it in white paper and writes the price on the outside in grease pencil. And this transaction is brief and businesslike, but also personal in the way that all exchanges are personal when they happen between people who have met regularly over years. He knows you take the chuck roast over the round for braising. You know he always gives a good trim. The checkout is unhurried. The cashier knows some of the items by sight without checking the price, because prices do not change week to week the way they eventually will, and the register is a mechanical thing that clacks and rings with a satisfying solidity. The groceries are bagged in paper, heavy brown bags that you carry on one arm with the other arm free, or that get loaded into the car if you have driven. You bring them into the kitchen and unpack them one by one onto the counter, putting things away in their established places, restoring the pantry and the refrigerator to their proper state of readiness. There is a satisfaction in this that is difficult to describe without sounding like you are romanticising what was also simply a chore. But the weekly shop in this decade has a completeness to it, a beginning and a middle and an end, the list made and the store visited and the bags unpacked, and the kitchen restocked for the week ahead. The household has been provisioned. The meals are possible. The week can proceed. We shop differently now, more frequently and less deliberately, picking up 2 or 3 things on the way home from somewhere else, ordering online for delivery, filling the cart at the enormous store that sells everything from groceries to lawn furniture in a space so large you can lose track of where you are. The food is there when we need it, and sometimes before we need it, and occasionally without our having specifically decided we needed it. The abundance is real, the planning is optional, and the envelope with the list on the back of it is largely a thing of the past. There is a particular smell that belongs to this decade and this room and no other, and once you know it, you can close your eyes and be there in an instant. Coffee. Always coffee. And beneath that, the ghost of last night's dinner still faintly in the air, and beneath that, something clean and faintly chemical from the linoleum polish, and above everything, the smell of whatever is happening on the stove right now, the onions just beginning to soften in butter, the soup simmering low with the lid cracked, the cake in the oven making the whole house warm and sweet in a way that has nothing to do with any candle ever made. You cannot buy this smell. You cannot recreate it with a diffuser or a spray. It is made of time and heat and repetition. The morning layer of the smell is coffee and toast and bacon fat warming in the skillet, a combination so specific to this hour and this era that it functions almost like a clock, telling you what time it is without your needing to look. By mid-morning the smell shifts, the breakfast fat fading and the cleaning products taking a turn, the ammonia of the floor mop and the particular sharp sweetness of dish soap, and beneath those the lingering warmth of the percolator still sitting on the burner with an inch of coffee cooling in the bottom. By afternoon the kitchen smell is quieter, waiting. This is the hour before the cooking begins again, and the room has a neutral quality to it, swept and wiped down and ready. A bowl of fruit on the counter contributes something faintly sweet. The bread in the bread box adds its particular warm staleness. If the windows are open, there is whatever the yard is doing coming in through the screen, cut grass or honeysuckle or the mineral smell of rain about to arrive, and the kitchen absorbs all of it and makes it part of its own ongoing character. Then the cooking begins, and the smell builds again from the bottom up. The onions go in first, always the onions, and their softening fills the kitchen with something that is both sweet and savoury, and neither entirely, a smell that is almost universally understood as the smell of dinner being made, of someone in a kitchen attending to the needs of people who will arrive hungry. The garlic goes in after, or the celery, or the tomatoes from the can, each one adding its layer to what is becoming the smell of tonight specifically, distinct from last Tuesday and next Thursday, a smell that will be remembered later as simply the way the kitchen smelled when you were growing up. Smell is the most honest sense in this regard. It does not allow for abstraction or interpretation, the way memory constructed from words and images sometimes does. When the smell of a 1960s kitchen reaches you, in the hallway of an old house or rising unexpectedly from a pot you have been tending without thinking, it does not suggest the past. It delivers it. You're briefly and completely there, in a kitchen with linoleum floors and a percolator on the counter, and something on the stove that has been cooking long enough to have filled the whole house. What has gone missing from the air of the modern kitchen is largely the evidence of time. The smell of food that has been cooking for 2 hours, the smell of a house that has been lived in by people who cooked in it every day, the accumulated warmth of a kitchen that was never entirely at rest. The modern kitchen can smell of many things, and some of them are wonderful, but they tend to arrive and depart quickly. The 30-minute meal, the reheated takeout, the coffee made and consumed before it has time to scent the whole floor. The air is cleaner, the ventilation is better, and something that lived in the thickness of that older air has gone with it. The water is as hot as your hands can stand, and the dish soap makes a mountain of foam in the left basin while the right fills with rinse water. There is an order to it. Glasses first because they are cleanest, then plates, then the pots, which require the most time and the most attention. You dry with a cotton towel that was a dish towel before it was your mother's, and a dish towel before it was her mother's, soft and slightly grey from 1,000 washings. The radio is on. Someone talks, or someone is quiet, and the dishes go back into the cabinet in the same order they always have. The same stack, the same shelf, the same arrangement that anyone in the family could find in the dark. The hot water comes from the tap in a rush that steams in the cool air above the sink, and you adjust the cold until the temperature is exactly where you want it, which is as hot as useful rather than as hot as possible, a distinction your hands make automatically. The dish soap is a particular brand in a bottle that lives on the left side of the sink, and a small amount goes a long way, which is the kind of thing you know without having been specifically told, because you watched it dispensed 1,000 times before you were old enough to do it yourself. Washing dishes by hand is slow in a way that is not entirely unpleasant. There is a rhythm to it. The soap and the scrub brush and the rinse and the dry, a sequence that repeats until the rack is full and the drying begins in earnest. It occupies the hands without occupying the mind, which means the mind can go where it needs to go, while the hands do what they know, and this particular quality of mindless usefulness is not nothing in a day that has required considerable attention. The radio helps. The conversation, if there is one, helps. The window above the sink, which looks out on the backyard going dark as the evening comes in, helps in its own quiet way. Children dry. This is an established household fact in most 1960s kitchens, a contribution to the family's domestic labour that is considered age-appropriate from roughly the time a child can be trusted not to drop the good plates. You stand beside the person washing, taking each item as it is passed to you, and you dry it and you put it away, and this small shared work is also, without either of you labelling it this way, a form of conversation, a proximity that produces talk that might not have happened otherwise. The things said while the hands are busy being easier to say than the things said while everyone is simply sitting still and looking at each other. The pot that held the roast requires steel wool and patience. The pan that made the gravy has a rim of cooked-on fat that needs to soak before it will yield. These are the last items to be washed, and they are always harder than everything that came before them, requiring a different quality of attention, a more deliberate scrubbing, and the satisfaction when they come clean is proportional to the effort. The clean pot gleaming under the kitchen light, proving itself empty and ready. When the last dish goes onto the shelf and the drying towel is hung over the oven handle, and the basins are rinsed and the soap bottle is moved back to its side of the sink, the kitchen is restored. It is the same kitchen it was this morning, ready again, the day's cooking absorbed and processed and put away. There is a completeness to this that the dishwasher, for all its genuine convenience, somewhat disperses, spreading the ending of the meal across hours until the cycle finishes and the unloading happens and the kitchen is finally technically clean. Washing dishes by hand ends when it ends. The kitchen knows immediately. It goes in the oven before church, low and slow, and by the time you come home the whole house has been transformed by its presence. The smell reaches you before you open the door, and it is the smell of Sunday, specific and absolute. This same Sunday smell you have known since you were small enough to need help getting into your chair. The roast is large enough to anchor dinner tonight and sandwiches tomorrow, and a soup or a stew later in the week, and nothing from it is wasted. The bones go into the stock pot. The drippings go into the jar on the refrigerator shelf. The leftover vegetables get eaten cold for lunch with a little salt. A single piece of meat feeds a family across 4 days, and no one considers this remarkable. The roast went in before you left this morning, set in its heavy pan with a scattering of carrots and onions and a cup of water in the bottom that will become the beginning of the gravy by the time you return. The oven was turned to low enough that nothing will scorch or dry in the hours you're away, and the house was left to its own warmth, while the family went to church in good clothes that will be changed immediately upon returning, because good clothes are for Sunday morning, and the rest of Sunday belongs to the house. When you come through the door, the smell is already in your coat before you've taken it off, and the warmth of the house is a different warmth than usual, denser and more fragrant, the oven having been running for 3 hours and the kitchen holding everything that has risen from that pan. You check the roast by lifting the lid, and the steam that escapes carries the concentrated smell of the meat, and the browned vegetables, and the dark liquid that has gathered in the bottom of the pan and reduced to something considerably more serious than the water you started with. The gravy is made from those drippings, with a competence that looks effortless because it has been practiced so many times that effortlessness is the correct description. The flour goes in and is stirred over heat until it darkens and the raw smell leaves it, and then the stock from the jar or the water from the pot, a cup at a time, stirred constantly while the gravy thickens from something thin and brown to something that coats the back of the spoon and holds a line when you drag your finger through it. The gravy is not optional. It is the Sunday roast's essential companion, the thing that ties the plate together, the thing that the bread is for. Sunday dinner happens in the early afternoon, the table set with more care than the weeknights, a cloth perhaps, the better plates, the gravy in its own dish with a ladle because that is how Sunday is different from Tuesday. The meal is unhurried in a way that weeknight meals are not, with more conversation and less urgency, and the particular ease that settles over a family when the week's obligations are briefly at rest. The children are allowed to sit longer. Someone might have seconds. The afternoon stretches out beyond the meal in the comfortable formlessness of a Sunday that has nowhere particular to be. And then the leftovers begin their quiet second life. Monday sandwiches are made from slices of cold roast, pressed between bread with mustard or mayonnaise, and they are good in the particular way that yesterday's roast is always good cold. The fat solidified slightly, the flavours more settled than they were fresh from the oven. Wednesday's soup uses the bones simmered overnight, the vegetables soft and the broth the colour of amber, the whole pot made from what would otherwise have been thrown away. The Sunday roast does not end on Sunday. It disperses into the week and feeds the family twice more, and makes the week feel provided for in a way that is difficult to replicate when each dinner stands alone. It sits on the counter between the bread box and the canisters, and it is always on. Not loud, never loud enough to talk over without effort, but present in the way that weather is present. A constant low background that makes the quiet feel inhabited rather than empty. The morning programs are different from the afternoon programs, and you know them the way you know your neighbours, by sound and habit and the shape they give to the hours. The kitchen radio does not demand anything of you. It does not ask you to look at it, to respond to it, to engage with it. It simply fills the room while you work, and the work goes easier for having something in the air. The dial is tuned to the same station it has been tuned to for years, changed only when someone reaches over and turns it deliberately, which happens rarely and with purpose. The morning news comes through in a voice that is authoritative and a little formal, and you absorb it while making breakfast, taking in the headlines the way you take in the weather report, as information about the world's state that you will carry into the day without necessarily doing anything about it. The announcer transitions to music, and the music transitions to a program, and the programs mark the morning, the way the clock on the wall marks the hours, one telling you what time it is, and the other telling you what kind of time it is. By mid-morning, the radio is playing something lighter, the daytime programming aimed at women in kitchens, and the hosts speak in a warm, companionable register that assumes you're there and going about your work and would like some company while you do it. There are contests occasionally, call-in segments where someone from the neighbourhood might phone in and be heard by everyone listening, which in a small community means that the radio occasionally delivers the voice of someone you actually know into your kitchen, and this is always a small, mild excitement even when the content is entirely ordinary. The afternoon soap operas are a different matter. They arrive after the lunch dishes and before the children come home from school, and they fill the kitchen with a kind of drama that stands in deliberate contrast to the domestic practicality of everything else happening in the room. Complicated things occur in those afternoon programs, things that would never occur in the kitchens of the women listening, and this contrast is part of the appeal. The ironing gets done, the beans get sorted, and somewhere in a fictional living room a woman confronts a man about something that has been building for 17 episodes. What the kitchen radio provides that no subsequent technology has quite replicated is presence without demand. It does not need to be looked at. It does not send notifications. It does not require a response or generate an obligation. It is simply sound in a room where someone is working, and its company is entirely on the listener's terms. You can attend to it closely or barely at all, and it gives the same amount of itself either way, the voices and the music continuing at their own steady pace, regardless of whether you're listening or not. The kitchen screen arrived later and brought with it a different quality of company, one that pulls the eye, that uses light and movement to request attention in a way that sound alone does not. Both have their value, but the radio understood something about a working kitchen that the screen sometimes forgets, that the best companion for someone whose hands are occupied is one that speaks without needing to be watched. For several weeks every summer and early fall, the kitchen stops being a place where meals are cooked and becomes something closer to a small manufacturing operation. The jars are being washed and sterilised. The lids are sorted into a bowl of hot water. The tomatoes are blanched and peeled in batches, the peaches sliced and sugared, the green beans packed tight into glass cylinders that will line the basement shelves and see the family through January and February when there is nothing fresh to be had. Your hands are stained, the kitchen is hot beyond reason, the jars click as they seal, and every click is a small victory, a meal saved, a winter made slightly more bearable. The canning equipment lives in a low cabinet or on a high shelf for most of the year, waiting. The big enamel canning pot, deep enough to submerge a quart jar completely, is too large for everyday use and too important to throw away. And when it comes down from the shelf in late July, it carries with it a particular anticipation, the same feeling that the first cold morning carries or the first warm one, the seasonal punctuation of a year organised around harvests and their preservation. The tongs are there, the jar lifter is there, The wide-mouthed funnel that makes filling the jars possible without losing half the tomatoes on the counter is there. The tomatoes take the longest and produce the most. You have bought them by the bushel from a farm stand or picked them from the garden, more tomatoes than the family could eat fresh in the time before they turn, and the solution is to make them permanent. The blanching goes quickly once you have the rhythm, the scored X in the bottom, the 30 seconds in boiling water, the cold bath where the skin slides off in your hand with a satisfying ease that never loses its small pleasure no matter how many tomatoes you have done. The peeled tomatoes go into the jar packed tight, their own juice filling the spaces between them, the jar held up to the light to check for air pockets before the lid goes on. The kitchen during preserving season is hotter than it is at any other time of year, even winter baking, because the canning pot must maintain a rolling boil for the full processing time, and the stove is running at a higher register than usual, and the summer heat is pressing in from outside regardless. You sweat through the work without considering stopping, because the work has a logic of its own that will not be interrupted. The tomatoes already blanched and peeled and waiting to be jarred, the jars already filled and waiting to go into the pot, the whole operation moving forward under its own momentum, and then the jars come out of the water bath and are set on a folded towel to cool, and within minutes the lids begin to click, the seal forming as the contents cool and contract, and each click is audible from the next room and everyone who hears it knows what it means. By morning the jars are cool and the lids are firm, and they go down to the basement shelf in rows, labelled in pencil with the contents and the date, and the shelf that was bare in June is full by September, and the winter that seemed abstract in July is now provided for in a way that is entirely concrete and entirely satisfying. We preserve food now, some of us, as a hobby or a revival practice, and it is genuinely valuable and genuinely satisfying in many of the same ways. But in the 1960s it is not a hobby. It is a response to the simple fact that summer produces more than summer can consume, and the question of what to do about that has a clear answer that requires effort and yields a basement full of jars, and this is simply what is done. The front door is for company and strangers. The back door is for everyone else, and in the 1960s everyone else is the whole neighbourhood. Your neighbour comes in without knocking, or with a knock so brief it is barely a formality, and she brings something, or she borrows something, or she simply sits at the kitchen table and talks while you finish what you're doing, because the kitchen is not a private space in this decade, it is a communal one. Recipes pass between houses like gossip. A cup of sugar borrowed on Tuesday becomes a slice of cake returned on Thursday. The kitchens of a block are connected by small exchanges that accumulate over years into something that looks very much like friendship. The back door opens directly into the kitchen in most houses of this era, which is not an architectural accident. The kitchen is where domestic life happens, and the back door is the entrance to domestic life, the entrance for the people who are part of your daily world rather than your formal one. You know which neighbours will knock and wait and which will knock and enter simultaneously, and neither habit requires comment because both are understood as expressions of closeness rather than breaches of it. The neighbour who walks straight in is the neighbour you've known long enough that waiting at the door would feel strange to both of you. What comes through the back door with the neighbours is various and constant. Someone brings a plate covered in wax paper with something on it, still warm from her oven, a gesture that requires nothing in return except the eventual return of the plate, which will go back to her house with something on it in turn, because this is how the exchange works and everyone understands it without discussion. Someone else borrows a cup of something and will replace it or forget to replace it, and either outcome is acceptable because the borrowing is not really about the cup of anything. It is about having a reason to come through the back door and sit at the table for a few minutes and not be entirely alone with the afternoon. The recipes that travel this route are different from the ones in the recipe box. Those are established family recipes, tested and trusted. The backdoor recipes are newer, more provisional, things one neighbour discovered and is passing along with the enthusiasm of someone who cannot keep a good thing to themselves. Here is what I did with the green beans. Here is what you can do with overripe bananas. Here is something I clipped from the paper that you have to try. The kitchen becomes a small clearinghouse for this kind of practical domestic intelligence, and the women who move through it are its contributors and its beneficiaries simultaneously. Children absorb this. They grow up understanding that the household does not exist in isolation, that the back door is always potentially in use, that a neighbour might appear at any time and be welcomed without the house needing to be in any particular state of readiness. This is a different relationship with privacy than the one that will eventually arrive, when the houses grow larger and the fences grow higher, and the back door becomes a door you lock as carefully as the front. But in this decade, in this kitchen, the door is the neighbourhood's door as much as yours, and the kitchen it opens into belongs, in small but real ways to everyone who walks through it. There are no protein bars on the counter. There is no smoothie being assembled in a blender at speed while someone checks their phone. Breakfast in the 1960s kitchen is cooked, or at the very least assembled with intention. Scrambled eggs in the cast iron, toast made in the chrome toaster that sparks occasionally but has never actually caught fire, orange juice squeezed from halves pressed on the glass juicer that lives on the counter near the sink. On school mornings there is oatmeal, on Saturdays there are pancakes, on Sundays there might be something more elaborate, and whatever it is eaten at the table while everyone is still in the house, before the day has broken into its separate pieces and carried everyone away. The oatmeal goes on early, cold water and a pinch of salt, and the rolled oats stirred in before the water reaches a boil, then the heat turned down and the lid set at an angle to let the steam escape while it thickens to the right consistency, which you know by the way the spoon moves through it, rather than by any measurement. A little brown sugar, a pat of butter that melts into the surface before anyone has come to the table. If there are raisins in the house, they go in during the last few minutes of cooking and plump slightly in the heat. And the children who like raisins and the children who do not have their established positions on this question, and voice them with the confidence of people who have been making this argument for their entire remembered lives. The eggs are a Saturday thing, or a Sunday thing, or a thing for the mornings when there is time to stand at the stove for 7 minutes and pay attention. Scrambled eggs in the 1960s kitchen are not far scrambled in a non-stick pan on high heat. They are made slowly, the cast iron at medium, the eggs beaten with a fork in the same bowl they were cracked into, the butter melted and the eggs poured in, and then moved with a spatula in slow, patient folds, while they set gradually from the bottom up, coming off the heat while they are still slightly underdone because the residual heat in the cast iron will finish them on the way to the table. This is not technique for technique's sake. It is just the way eggs are cooked here, absorbed from watching and now done automatically. The orange juice is fresh on the mornings when oranges have been bought and someone has risen early enough to halve them and press them on the glass juicer, and canned on the mornings when they have not. The canned juice mixed from frozen concentrate in a pitcher with 3 cans of water, the way the can instructs, stirred until the concentrate dissolves and the colour goes from dull orange to something closer to what orange juice is supposed to look like. Both are called orange juice, and both are accepted as orange juice, and no one makes a distinction between them that requires defence. The table is set before the family sits. This is not a small thing. Setting the table is its own act of intention, the announcement that breakfast is happening here and will be eaten properly, with plates and utensils and a glass for the juice, and a cup for the coffee and a napkin, because napkins are part of how meals are eaten in this house. The act of sitting down together before the day begins creates something that the morning eaten on the way out the door cannot. A brief shared pause before the family disperses, a moment when everyone is in the same room going nowhere, eating something that was made for them and only for them, and nothing else is required. There is no vegetable drawer full of pre-washed lettuce. There is no shelf of individual yogurt cups, no bin of pre-marinated meat, no drawer for cheese sticks and string cheese, and convenient single-serving portions of anything. The 1960s refrigerator holds what was bought and what was cooked, and not much more, because there was not much more to hold. This scarcity, and it is a kind of scarcity even if no one calls it that, shapes every meal in ways that go so deep they become invisible. You cook what you have, you eat what you cooked, you plan the next day's meals around what is left. The refrigerator is not a storage unit. It is a conversation between what you brought home and what the week requires. The shelves hold specific things in specific places, and the organization is practical rather than aspirational. The milk on the right where everyone can reach it. The butter on the inside of the door, which is the warmest spot and therefore correct for something that should be soft. The leftover soup in a pot with a plate set on top of it, because there are not enough lids for every pot in the kitchen, and a plate serves the same function. The cheese wrapped in wax paper, and then in a slightly damp cloth to keep the cut surface from drying and going hard. Each thing has been put where it is for a reason, and the reason is practical. And the woman who organised it could tell you the reason for every item without opening the door. What is not in the refrigerator is revealing. There is no bottle of water, because water comes from the tap and is drunk from a glass, and the idea of storing water in the refrigerator in individual plastic bottles has not arrived yet, and will seem strange for a long time after it does. There is no single-serving anything, no portion of food packaged for one person to consume on their own without preparation, because the household eats together and the food is prepared for the table, rather than for individual consumption at individual moments. The refrigerator is a household tool, not a vending machine, and the food inside it is raw material for meals rather than finished products waiting to be opened. The leftover system is a refrigerator logic all its own. A bowl covered with an inverted plate. A pot with a lid that does not quite fit but is close enough. A piece of foil crimped carefully around the end of something that will become a sandwich tomorrow. These improvisations are not signs of inadequacy. They are signs of a household that knows exactly what it has and exactly what it intends to do with it. The leftovers not forgotten in the back of the refrigerator. They are the next meal, already accounted for in the planning. Looking into a 1960s refrigerator is looking into the week's intentions. You can see what is being saved and what will be used tomorrow and what is nearly gone and will need to be replenished on Thursday. It is a document of the household's relationship with food, which is a relationship characterized by attention and intention, and the understanding that nothing in there arrived by accident, and nothing should leave without having served its purpose. We have more in our refrigerators now than most families in 1962 would have thought necessary or possible. The abundance is real, and it produces its own problems. The produce drawer that becomes a place things are sent to die, the leftovers that get pushed back until they are no longer identifiable, the expiration dates that we check and then ignore and then check again. The refrigerator has grown large enough to absorb our inattention, which is a convenience and also, quietly, a loss of the particular relationship with food that scarcity and intention once required. They stand in a row on the counter, 4 of them, each one labelled in a script that might be painted or printed or stamped into the ceramic, and they have been standing in this row for so long that the counter beneath them is slightly lighter in those 4 precise spots. Sugar, flour, coffee, tea. You reach for them without looking. The lids fit the way lids should, with a satisfying weight and a slight give, and the interiors smell of whatever they hold, the particular sweetness of white sugar, the dry dusty warmth of flour, the dark richness of ground coffee waiting to become morning. These are not decorative objects. They are working ones, reached for daily, refilled without ceremony, as ordinary and essential as the hands that opened them. The canister set was a wedding gift, or it was bought the year the kitchen was redone, or it came from a department store in a box and was set on the counter that first morning in the new house and has not moved since. Its provenance does not matter much because its presence is so established that it belongs to the counter the way the window belongs to the wall, as something that was always there and would be immediately wrong if it were not. The 4 canisters graduate slightly in size from largest to smallest, flour being the most consumed and therefore deserving the most space, tea being the least and therefore the smallest at the end of the row nearest the window. The flour canister is the one that gets the most attention. You lift its lid several times a week, scooping into it with the same cup measure that lives inside, its handle resting against the interior wall, and you level the top with the straight edge of a knife the way you were shown, because packed flour and properly measured flour are different things, and the difference matters in baking in ways that are unforgiving. The inside of the flour canister develops a fine white dust on its walls that you wipe out when you refill it, the cloth coming away with a coating of white that smells of nothing and everything at once, the smell of 1,000 biscuits and pie crusts and cakes that have passed through this container on their way to becoming something. The sugar canister has a different interior, crystalline and faintly sticky near the bottom, where moisture has found its way in over the years despite the lid's best efforts. A small clump forms sometimes and you break it apart with a spoon before measuring, working the crystals loose until they pour freely again. The sugar smells clean and sharp in a way that is different from the sweetness of the thing it will become once it is combined with butter and eggs and heat. And this rawness of it, uncooked and crystalline, is its own distinct quality that belongs entirely to this moment before the bowl. The coffee canister holds ground coffee that was either bought ground or ground at home in the small electric grinder that sits near the percolator, and its smell when you lift the lid is the most insistent smell in the kitchen at this particular moment of the morning, cutting through everything else the room contains and announcing itself as the most urgent of the day's requirements. You measure it by the familiar scoop, the same amount every morning, not from a recipe, but from the accumulated knowledge of how many scoops make the coffee the right strength for this household, which is not the same number that would be right for the household next door. The tea canister is the quietest of the 4, reached for in the afternoon or on the evenings when coffee feels like too much and something gentler is wanted. The loose tea inside or the paper-wrapped bags pressed in with the tin lid clicked shut over them smells of something distant and slightly floral, and there is a ritual to the making of tea that is different in character from the making of coffee, slower and more deliberate, the kettle watched until it sings, the cup warmed first if there is time, the steeping timed by feel rather than clock. Tea is what you make when the day has asked more of you than coffee can address. These 4 canisters contain, in their modest way, the basic vocabulary of the 1960s kitchen. Sugar for the baking and the coffee, flour for the biscuits and the gravy and the pie crust, coffee for the morning and the mid-morning and the after-dinner cup that keeps the conversation going, tea for the afternoons and the evenings and the moments when someone is unwell, and the kettle going on is the first useful thing anyone can think to do. They are the most reached for objects in the kitchen after the pots and the pans, and their constancy, their daily presence in the same 4 spots on the same counter, is a form of reliability so steady it passes entirely beneath notice until the day one of them is moved or broken, and the counter looks suddenly incomplete in a way that is disproportionate to the size of the object missing. We have canisters still, many of us, and they perform the same function and sit in similar rows on similar counters, but the kitchen has expanded around them in ways that have diluted their centrality. The ingredients they hold now compete with a pantry full of alternatives, the almond flour and the coconut sugar, and the half-dozen varieties of tea sorted by mood and occasion. The canister set remains. The simplicity it once represented is the thing that has quietly moved on. You do not make two dinners. There is the meal, and there is eating the meal, and the space between those two things is where negotiations happen in every family in every decade. But in the 1960s kitchen, the negotiations are shorter because the outcome is less in doubt. You eat what is on your plate, or you sit with it until you do, and the menu does not pivot around any single child's preferences. Vegetables are served because vegetables are part of dinner. Liver appears occasionally and is eaten with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Dessert is not assumed. It is earned, or it's simply not mentioned, because some nights there is no dessert and no one thinks to ask. The plate put in front of a child in this decade is the same plate put in front of everyone else at the table, proportioned smaller but composed identically. The same meat and the same vegetables and the same starch, assembled without consultation and presented without negotiation. The child's job is to eat it, or to make a reasonable effort, and the adult's job is to ensure that effort happens, which is accomplished through a combination of patience and the simple structural fact that there is nothing else forthcoming. The kitchen does not have a second menu. The pantry does not contain the backup meal. What is on the plate is what dinner is, and dinner is what is available, and this clarity, while not always welcome from the child's perspective, has the virtue of being entirely honest. There are foods that most children in this decade resist with a passion that seems out of proportion to the food itself. Cooked spinach is one, liver is another, pan-fried in butter with onions that have caramelized sweet and soft, the whole thing smelling better than it will be received by anyone under 12, beets that bleed their dark red across everything else on the plate, peas that have been cooked too long and have lost their sweetness and become something grey and yielding that the fork does not want to engage with. These foods appear anyway because they are nutritious and inexpensive, and because the adult who put them there ate them at the same age and survived, and does not consider this a hardship worth accommodating. The strategy for managing a resistant child varies by household and by parent and by the particular child, but it tends toward the consistent application of a simple rule rather than the elaborate negotiation that will eventually become more common. You try it. You eat a reasonable portion. You do not make a production of your feelings about it. These instructions are delivered not unkindly, but firmly, with the weight of an expectation behind them that does not anticipate serious challenge, and often this weight is enough, the fork moving to the mouth less because the food is appealing, and more because the alternative is sitting at the table, long past the point when everyone else has been excused. What children eat in the 1960s kitchen is, by most subsequent standards, uncomplicated and relatively uniform. There are no superfoods on the plate, no quinoa, no avocado, no deliberately colourful arrangements intended to make vegetables appealing through their visual presentation. There is meat and a vegetable and a starch, and these things are cooked simply and served hot and expected to be eaten. The nutritional thinking behind the meal is intuitive rather than scientific. The understanding that a balanced plate contains protein and vegetables and something filling, and that this combination, repeated daily, constitutes adequate feeding of a child. And yet something in this uncomplicated approach produces something worth noticing. Children who ate whatever was put in front of them tend to grow into adults who eat widely, who do not require special accommodation at other people's tables, who can sit down to an unfamiliar meal and eat it with genuine interest, rather than the vague anxiety of someone whose palate was carefully curated from infancy. The liver they hated at 8 is sometimes the thing they order at 40, remembering it differently than they expected to, tasting in it something of the kitchen it came from, the pan and the butter and the onions going soft and the evening that surrounded, the whole complicated experience of being a child at a table where dinner was simply what it was. At some point in this decade, the kitchen begins to become a room that is thought about aesthetically, not just functionally, and the result arrives in warm yellows and avocado greens and copper brown that will be deeply fashionable for roughly 15 years before becoming the subject of gentle ridicule. But in the moment of its arrival, the colour is hopeful. The appliance manufacturers understand something important, that a woman who spends most of her waking hours in a kitchen might want that kitchen to feel like more than a utility. So the refrigerator comes in harvest gold, and the range comes in harvest gold, and the canisters on the counter are chosen to coordinate, and the kitchen becomes, for a brief window of time, something that is trying to be beautiful. The harvest gold is not subtle. It is warm and saturated and entirely committed to itself, a colour that does not hedge or qualify, but simply arrives and fills the room with the particular cheerfulness of something that believes wholeheartedly in its own rightness. Against white walls it glows. Against wood cabinets it deepens. In morning light it looks like something between butter and sunflower, and in the afternoon light it shifts slightly towards something richer, and in the evening under the overhead fixture it becomes the colour of a kitchen that has been warm all day and intends to stay that way. The avocado green arrives alongside the gold and occupies a slightly different register, cooler and earthier, closer to the garden than to the pantry. It appears on stand mixers and canisters and the occasional refrigerator in a household whose aesthetic leans slightly more toward the natural than the warm. The two colours are understood as belonging to the same family, the family of 1960s kitchen optimism, the belief that the room where the family's daily life is sustained deserves to be considered as carefully as the living room that guests will see. This is a shift in thinking that has not always been present. The kitchen, that was purely functional, purely practical, without aesthetic ambition, is the kitchen of earlier decades. This one is trying. The linoleum goes down in patterns that coordinate with the appliances, small geometric repeats in complementary colours, or a speckled pattern in warm neutrals that will not show every crumb, and is therefore both practical and pleasant, which is the combination the 1960s kitchen is always reaching for. The curtains at the window above the sink are chosen with some attention to how they will look when the sun comes through them in the morning, and the answer in most kitchens of this era is a cheerful print, fruit or gingham or something with a small repeated flower, hung on a rod above the glass and tied back during the day to let the light in. There is something worth honouring in this impulse toward beauty in the workspace, even if the specific colours that expressed it have since been absorbed into a long cultural joke. The women who chose harvest gold were not making an error in taste. They were making an argument, quietly and through the medium of appliance colour, that their workspace had the same claim on beauty and consideration as any other room in the house, that the hours spent in it deserved to be spent somewhere that had been thought about with care. The harvest gold kitchen is gone now from most houses, renovated out of existence in the 1980s and 90s, when the stainless steel and white began their long dominance. But in the right light, in the right house, in a kitchen that has not been touched since the year it was done, the gold still glows the way it was always meant to, warm and settled and entirely certain of its own welcome in the room. It is not nostalgia exactly, because nostalgia implies a longing for something you had, and many of the people watching this were not alive in this decade, and never stood at this sink or opened this refrigerator, or listened to this particular radio between these particular walls. It is something else, something harder to name, the sense of a relationship with food and time and daily labour that felt rooted in a way that is harder to find now. You knew where dinner came from because you made it. You knew what was in the house because you bought it and stored it and watched it diminish over the course of a week. The kitchen was not a backdrop to your life. It was, in a very literal sense, where life happened. What the 1960s kitchen gave to the people who lived in it was a particular quality of dailiness, the experience of a life organised around recurring acts that were physical and purposeful, and connected to the basic human need to eat and to feed others. The percolator every morning, the grocery list on Thursday, the pot roast on Sunday, the canning in August. These things were not interruptions to life. They were the structure of it, the recurring acts that gave the week its shape and the year its rhythm, and the household its particular character among all the other households on the block. There is a word in other languages for this quality. The Danish hygge gestures toward it. The Japanese concept of touches its edges, but English has no single word for the warmth produced by recurring domestic acts, performed with care in a space that has been made one's own. We reach instead for atmosphere or coziness or homeliness, none of which quite captures the specific texture of a kitchen that is in daily use by people who know each other well, where the radio is on, and something is simmering, and the coffee cup from this morning has been washed and is waiting on the shelf for tomorrow morning when it will be needed again. The rhythm that the 1960s kitchen demanded of its primary occupant was also, in ways not always recognised at the time, a kind of anchor. To know that dinner must be started by 4 means knowing where you are at 4. To have the weekly shop on Thursday means having a Thursday that is organised around that fact. To have the bread box empty on Friday means knowing that bread needs to be bought or made before the weekend. These small recurring obligations are constraints certainly, and the women who lived inside them did not always experience them as gifts. But they are also a form of structure that gives the days their definition, that makes the week feel like something with a shape, rather than a formless succession of hours. What many people feel when they encounter the idea of the 1960s kitchen, even without having lived in one, is the echo of that structure. The sense that somewhere, in some version of daily life, the relationship between a person and the food they ate was more intimate and more intentional than it tends to be now. That the acts of buying and storing and cooking and eating and washing up were not separate tasks to be dispatched efficiently, but a single continuous practice that connected a person to their household, and their household to the neighbourhood, and the neighbourhood to the season, and the season to the year. We have not lost cooking. We have not lost kitchens. What is harder to locate is the quality of attention that daily cooking from scratch required and rewarded. The particular kind of presence that comes from doing something with your hands every day that cannot be done inattentively and that feeds the people you love. That quality does not require a harvest gold refrigerator or a manual can opener or a percolator on the back burner. It requires only the decision to be in the kitchen, regularly, with intention, in the way that the women of this decade were in their kitchens, whether they chose it or not. The choice, for most of us now, is the thing that has changed. And choice, as it turns out, is both the gift and the complication. Stand in a modern kitchen for a moment and let yourself notice what is here now that wasn't then. The microwave, the food processor, the refrigerator that makes its own ice and filters its own water and tells you when it needs to be cleaned. The delivery app on your phone that means dinner can arrive at your door in 40 minutes without anyone having touched a pan. The frozen meal that goes from box to table in 8 minutes. None of these things are wrong. Most of them are genuinely good. And yet there is something in this room that the 1960s kitchen had that is harder to locate now. A quality of dailiness, of the meal as something that required your presence and your attention and your hands, something that connected you to the basic animal fact of needing to eat and choosing, every day, to be the one who made sure that happened. What we gained is measurable and real and worth stating plainly. Time above all, and this is not a small thing. The hours recovered from the daily labour of cooking from scratch have been redirected into education and careers and creative work, and the kind of rest that was genuinely difficult to find in a household organised entirely around domestic production. The convenience that the modern kitchen offers is not a trick or a substitution. It is genuine expansion of possibility for the people who were once most constrained by the kitchen's demands, and to pretend otherwise would be dishonest about what that constraint cost. We gained safety too in the slow departure of the practices that seemed ordinary in 1962 and were understood only later to carry risk. The lead in the paint on the kitchen walls, the pesticides on the produce washed only cursorily if at all, the preserved foods processed at home in conditions that were not always as sterile as the canning guides assumed. The modern kitchen is a safer place to prepare food than its predecessor, and the food that comes from it is, by most measures, more reliably free of the contaminations that sent people to the doctor, with ailments that were never correctly attributed. And we gained variety, the extraordinary proliferation of ingredients and cuisines and techniques that the 1960s kitchen could not have imagined. The spice aisle that now occupies the space that once held a few tins of salt and pepper and paprika, the produce section that offers in December what once required the height of summer, the cooking traditions of cultures that were invisible or inaccessible in the American kitchen of this decade now available in cookbooks and online, and in the restaurants that have changed the way a generation understands what food can be. What we lost is harder to inventory, because most of it was never inventoried to begin with. The daily rhythm organised around the meal, the particular quality of attention that cooking from scratch demanded and cultivated. The knowledge that lived in the hands rather than the recipe card, the knowledge of how things feel and smell and sound when they are being done correctly. The neighbourhood of back doors and borrowed cups and recipes passed between women who knew each other's kitchens as well as their own. The long simmering Sunday that stretched from morning to afternoon and fed the family across the week. What the kitchen remembers is everything that happened in it, and this is the thing that makes these rooms, even decades later, carry such weight. A kitchen is not neutral. It holds the accumulated warmth of every meal cooked in it, every conversation had across its table, every morning begun at its counter with a cup of something hot, and the day still ahead. The 1960s kitchen holds all of this and more, the labour that went unrecorded and the love that went unnamed and the daily domestic competence that was simply expected, and therefore never praised, and therefore sometimes, in the retelling, forgotten. It deserves to be remembered. Not as a simpler time, because it was not simpler for the people living in it, but as a time when the kitchen was the centre, and the centre held, and dinner was on the table, and the family sat down together, and for 20 unhurried minutes the day paused and everyone was in the same room going nowhere. That is what the kitchen remembers, and that is what, in our quieter moments, we are reaching toward when we reach for it. There is a dish in the oven right now, and it has been there for the better part of an hour, and the smell coming from it is the smell of several things becoming one thing, which is the essential promise of the casserole, and the reason it dominates the 1960s kitchen table with a confidence that no single ingredient dish can quite match. It might be tuna and noodles bound with cream of mushroom soup and topped with crushed crackers that have gone golden in the heat. It might be ground beef and rice layered with tomatoes and cheese, or chicken pieces nestled into a sauce that started as a can of something and has been transformed by an hour of low heat into something that tastes as though it took considerably more effort than it did. The casserole does not pretend to be elegant. It pretends to be dinner, and at this it succeeds completely. The casserole dish itself is a heavy thing, ceramic or glass, deep enough to hold the full construction of whatever is being made in it, and wide enough that the top layer browns evenly across its entire surface. It goes from the oven to the table without stopping, set on a folded dish towel to protect the surface, and it serves from the same vessel it cooked in, which means one less pot to wash and one more reason to love it. The casserole is practical in this way from its first premise to its last, a dish conceived entirely around the realities of cooking for a family on a weeknight when the afternoon has been full and the evening is not long, and everyone arrives at the table hungry and without patience for anything that requires more than a serving spoon to distribute. What makes the casserole work as a cultural artifact as well as a meal is the way it absorbs the available ingredients of a given household and week. It is not a rigid recipe in the way that a roast is a rigid recipe. It is more of a structure, a method for combining a protein and a starch and a binding sauce and a topping into something that holds together in the oven and comes apart easily on the plate. And within that structure there is considerable room for what is on hand. The cream of mushroom soup that appears in so many 1960s casserole recipes is not there because it is irreplaceable, but because it is reliable, because it provides the binding element without requiring the cook to make a sauce from scratch on a night when making a sauce from scratch is one step too many. Church cookbooks of this era are casserole archives, spiral-bound collections of recipes submitted by the women of the congregation and printed in small quantities and sold at fundraisers, and they reveal something true about the 1960s kitchen. Every contributor has a casserole. Every casserole has a name, usually the contributor's name followed by the word special or the word surprise, and the surprise is almost always cheese, appearing either within the layers or melted across the top in a bubbling crust that is the casserole's greatest visual achievement. These books are a record of what women actually cooked on Wednesday evenings in 1964, and the record is overwhelmingly one of ingenuity and practicality and the particular creativity that works within constraints rather than against them. The casserole fell out of fashion in the decades that followed, associated too closely with the era it came from, too humble for the food culture that arrived in its place. But it never disappeared from the tables of people who cook for families on weeknights with limited time and a pantry of reliable staples, because it never stopped being the most honest answer to the question of what to make for dinner when the answer needs to be ready by 6. It is a narrow cabinet, or a single shelf, or a wooden rack mounted to the wall near the stove, and what it holds is modest by any subsequent standard. A collection of perhaps a dozen jars and tins that constitutes the full, aromatic vocabulary of this kitchen. Salt in its shaker and in its box. Black pepper in a small tin with a perforated top. Paprika, the sweet kind, used for colour as much as flavour, and shaken over devilled eggs and potato salad with the liberality of someone applying decoration rather than seasoning. Garlic powder rather than garlic, because garlic powder keeps and measures predictably and requires no peeling or chopping on a weeknight. Onion powder for the same reasons. Cinnamon and nutmeg for the baking. A small tin of dry mustard that gets used perhaps 4 times a year but is considered essential. Bay leaves in a small bag, dried and slightly brittle, added to soups and stews and removed before serving by whoever remembers to look for them. This is the complete collection for most 1960s kitchens, and within it the cook produces an entire year of meals with a consistency of flavour that is specific to this household alone. Every family's spice cabinet is slightly different in its emphasis, and these small differences produce meals that are recognisably distinct even when the recipe is identical. The household that uses more paprika, the one that uses less salt, the one where someone has a heavy hand with the garlic powder, and everyone who has eaten there can identify it in retrospect, without being able to name the specific thing that makes the food taste the way it does. The spice tins are often old, not old in the sense of expired, though some of them are certainly past their best, but old in the sense of having been in this cabinet for years, the labels faded and the lid slightly sticky from the heat of the kitchen and the repeated openings. A spice tin in the 1960s kitchen is not replaced until it is empty, and it is not purchased in duplicate because there is no space for duplicate anything, and because it will be used eventually if you wait long enough. The nutmeg tin that was bought for the Christmas pudding 3 years ago will be used again next Christmas pudding, and not before, and this is entirely acceptable. The narrow range of this spice collection shapes the food that comes from this kitchen in ways that are profound and unremarkable simultaneously. The cuisine of the American 1960s home kitchen is a cuisine of salt and pepper and paprika and bay leaf, of onion powder carrying the allium note through dishes where fresh onion would require one more thing to chop, of cinnamon in the apple pie and the oatmeal in the sweet potato casserole at Thanksgiving. It is a flavour profile that is warm and familiar and deeply specific to its time, and tasting it now, in food made by someone who learned to cook in this decade, produces a recognition that bypasses analysis entirely and arrives as pure memory, immediate and complete. We have expanded the spice cabinet considerably in the decades since, accumulated the cumin and the coriander and the smoked paprika and the turmeric and the dozens of blends and pastes that global cooking has made available and American kitchens have absorbed. The expansion is genuine enrichment, but the simplicity of those 12 jars and tins produce something that complexity sometimes cannot. A coherent and recognizable flavour that belonged to a specific place and time and household, a taste that meant home. It hangs on the wall above the doorway or sits on the counter between the canisters and the toaster, and it is always visible from the stove, which is not an accident. The kitchen clock is a working clock in the most literal sense, consulted throughout the day not for the idle awareness of what time it is, but for the specific practical knowledge of how much longer something has been in the oven, and whether the children need to be called in from outside, and whether there is enough time before dinner to do the one other thing that needs to be done this afternoon. It has a plain face and clear numbers, and a second hand that moves in the steady mechanical sweep of a clock that has never been asked to do anything except tell the truth about time. The kitchen clock and the cooking are in constant conversation. You put the roast in at 2 and the clock tells you when it has been in for an hour, and when it has been in for 2, and when the internal logic of the recipe says it should be done, which you verify not by the clock alone but by the fork pressed into the thickest part, and the colour of the juices and the smell that has shifted slightly in the last half hour from raw meat cooking to something caramelised and finished. The clock is the starting point of this calculation, the anchor from which you measure, but the cooking itself tells you when it is done, and the skill is in knowing how to read both. Time in the 1960s kitchen moves at the speed of the things being cooked in it, which is to say it moves at a pace that cannot be accelerated beyond certain limits. The beans take as long as the beans take. The bread rises when it is ready and not before. The custard sets in its own time, and rushing it produces something weeping and grainy that is not custard and cannot be recovered. There is a natural tempo to this kitchen that is set by biology and chemistry, rather than by preference, and the cook who works within it develops a relationship with time that is patient in specific ways, not patient by nature necessarily, but patient about the things that patience is required for and efficient about everything else. Children grow up in this kitchen understanding that some things cannot be hurried, that the smell coming from the oven means it is not ready yet, and asking about it will not change that fact. That dinner is at 6 because 6 is when dinner is ready, and the clock above the door will confirm this independently. This is a different relationship with waiting than the one that will come later, when the microwave proposes that most foods can be ready in minutes, and the idea of a process that takes 2 hours becomes something requiring justification. In this kitchen, 2 hours is simply how long the roast takes, and the afternoon is organised around that fact rather than the other way around. The kitchen clock marks something larger than the cooking times. It marks the structure of the day, which in a household organised around mealtimes is a day that has fixed points, moments when everyone is expected to be in the same place doing the same thing, and the time between those fixed points is the space in which everything else happens. Breakfast ends and the day opens. Lunch arrives and briefly gathers the household again. Dinner closes the day and gathers it once more. The clock above the doorway is the timekeeper of this rhythm, the steady mechanical heartbeat of a household in motion. And so we come to the end of our time in this kitchen. We have stood at the counter while the percolator finished its slow, steady work. We have watched the Sunday roast go into the oven before church and come out transformed, filling the house with a smell that meant safety and Sunday, and the particular warmth of a meal that would feed the family across the whole week ahead. We have heard the radio on the counter and the screen door at the back of the house, and the quiet click of a jar sealing itself in the evening after the canning was done, each sound small and ordinary and, in its own unhurried way, essential. The people who lived in these kitchens did not think of themselves as living through something worth remembering. They were simply living. They were making the coffee and wiping the counter and writing the grocery list on the back of an envelope, and feeding the people they loved with the ingredients they had and the skills they could learn by standing beside someone who already knew how. They were doing what the day asked of them, one ordinary task at a time, and the accumulated weight of all those ordinary tasks was a life, full and warm and real. What they knew, and what we are perhaps still learning, is that the small things are not small. The set table and the made meal and the dish dried and put back in its place are not interruptions to a life of meaning. They are the meaning, quiet, repeated, and freely given. So carry something forward from this kitchen tonight, even something very small. A moment of stillness before the day begins. A meal made with your hands,